work as an accidental evaluator, as I've often said, through a career working with advocates, advocacy efforts, constituency building efforts on rather unpopular issues, principally in sexual and reproductive health and rights. But about 15 years ago, we noticed that there was a lot of demand from advocates and from their funders to think about how we know we're making a difference in this area. So about 15 years ago, we got started thinking about that. For about the last 10 years, it's essentially what I've done full time. And in that context, story, narrative, the power of impact stories comes up a lot. For example, at the Aspen Institute, we've just changed our annual report to a series of impact stories from the various 30-odd policy programs of the Aspen Institute, plus all of our leadership efforts, all the work that 500-odd employees of the Aspen Institute do around the world. And that's lovely. It is not, however, clear that the plural of impact stories is data either. But they sure are nice and they look good in our beautifully designed annual report. But narrative change, which is kind of at the heart of a lot of what we're talking about here, is a really hot topic right now. It's the study that Michael didn't get to talk about, Story Behind the Story, is a study put out by the Transparency and Accountability Initiative, puts together some really interesting reflection and research on this question. The Ford founded more evidence of the hotness of narrative change. The Ford Foundation asks its grant makers to think about what narrative change means in the context of their work to effect social change. However, in a conversation with one of their evaluation team last week, she confessed, we don't know what we mean by narrative change. And in fact, the key question, and it's just come up now in a couple of our presentations, is how to measure that. And to give Sherry a shout out, your team did a very rigorous job of attempting to measure the impact of Integrity Icon, and some admirable work there that you all should find out about from her. Technically challenging, but I think really quite powerful. And also, another plug for the evaluation side before I tell a story, ORS Impact out in Seattle in July 2019, and I suppose folks in this room have read this. ORS Impact released a report called Measuring Narrative Change, which looks at many models and frameworks for attempting to do exactly that. And I recommend taking a look at it. They conclude narrative change is a complex, messy, non-linear process, but it also has the potential to drive social change in powerful ways. This means that measuring narrative change, both in terms of understanding shifts in narrative and the results of those shifts, is simultaneously highly challenging and extremely valuable. Messy, incidentally, is a technical evaluation term, as is squishy, which is a lot of the work that we do. So, narrative change, all true, all of the comments from what you heard from previous speakers, all true but not new. And so if you'll permit me an okay boomer moment, 20 years ago, we commissioned research at the Aspen Institute from George Lakoff, who is famous for Don't Think of an Elephant. Everybody know that? Oh, check it out. His point is that if I tell you to not think of an elephant, you cannot help but think of an elephant. So the larger point is the deeper structures of our minds form frames. And yes, y'all have heard this in communications context. Frames get deeply embedded and they shape the way we see the world. And in order to help people hear your truth, you need to change the frame so that they can actually see that. That's the basic insight. 20 years ago, we hired Lakoff and some of his acolytes, including Susan Bales from Frameworks Institute, to help us understand how Americans understood our role in the world in the post-Cold War world. Now, this was 20 years ago. We're already 10 years beyond the end of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Iron Curtain. We were still talking about a post-Cold War world. That's crazy. You don't name it by what it isn't, shit. You name it by what you want it to become. And so the research that we commissioned, and I'll do this quickly, looked at how can we reframe so that my cousin Donna in Indiana can see the world as something other than the dominant frame that we are all, as Americans, we're basically all seeing it through. And I can talk more about the details of that, but it was actually very effective work. And then this thing happened called 9/11, and our ability to tell a story about how we can cooperate with others in the world. When we look at the Earth from space, it's this borderless blue marble and a marvel, and all of the things that concern us most in the world are global in scope, and they move across those boundaries without any acknowledgement of them. So we as a nation, we as Americans, need to see ourselves in the world as working with others in teamwork to address these issues. It's the only way change can happen. That was the reframe. 9/11 happens, we're all back to global chaos, global mayhem, and fear. And really, nothing has changed in the last 18 years in that. And so that's a sad story of how the best intentions for reframing and the best intentions for our advocacy work are subject to vicissitudes over which we have no control. So my last takeaway advice before I shut up for good is don't overpromise about the power of narrative change. Don't overpromise about what we can accomplish or the change that we can attribute to our work. Let's be really humble about this work as we go forward. Thanks.